All right, RFK is saying eat more saturated fat is driving the so-called health experts crazy. You may have seen recent headlines like this one saying Robert F. Kennedy urges people to eat more saturated fat. And the reality is that what he is urging people to eat are more whole unprocessed foods that happen to contain saturated fat, things like meat and eggs and dairy products and so on and so forth. And that is, quite honestly, a very different situation than where the average American gets their saturated fat from. Let's unpack some of the science around some of this stuff. Okay, as I said, we can look at this data here where it shows that the majority of saturated fats are not coming from things like beef. In fact, beef makes up a very small, only a few percentage points of where the average American gets their saturated fat. Most of the saturated fat is coming from things like desserts and processed foods and sandwiches and lasagnas and pizzas and things like that. So those are very different than whole food products like meat, milk, and eggs, seafood, things of that nature. So that's something we should be mindful of. The average American gets most of their saturated fat from basically junk food, and it's likely that any statistical epidemiological relationships which show negative outcomes from saturated fat are merely a reflection of a crappy diet overall. Nutritional epidemiologic studies are not very good for determining long-term health outcomes. At best, you can do short-term studies which might show a change in biomarkers, but that does not necessarily equate to heart disease, cancer, early death, or any of those things. And the people that sort of make their living, using this data are basically failing to tell you that they're using really kind of weak data. All right, let's take a look at this paper from the Journal of American College of Cardiology. It came out in around 2020. It talks about the fact that saturated fat in these whole foods, as we talked about, are not associated with things like heart disease. I mean, it's pretty clear that whole food, natural products are generally healthy for us. And there are plenty of studies out there now that show that, whole fat dairy is fine, that meat is fine, eggs are fine. And we see these epidemiologic studies that go all over the place. They're just not very good studies. And so when we go back to very sort of first basic common sense principles, these are the foods that made humans human beings in many ways. These are the foods that we have always eaten throughout the course of time, and these recent increases in obesity and diabetes and all the other diseases that go with that are products of a modern food environment. And these are very old foods. So that's just common sense, to say the least. The heavy reliance on epidemiologic studies to drive policy or to make proclamations belies the fact that the high quality studies like the RCTs just don't support for the most part, those conclusions. This is a nice study looking at a meta-analysis of RCTs asking whether lowering saturated fat in the diet would effectively decrease incidence of cardiovascular disease. And the answer was no, it did not. This is something that people have fought about for many, many decades. Our guidelines have recommended low fat, as you guys know, since basically the 1980s. And it has not driven down the chronic disease epidemic for sure. You can argue about cardiovascular mortality being better because we have more life-saving techniques and technologies, and we've also limited our smoking significantly. We went from a high of about 45% of the Americans smoking in 1954 to today where about 12 to 13% of us smoke. And so that alone had a massive impact on cardiovascular survival, cardiovascular incidence, and then of course the advanced technological things that we've done. So the dietary change to a low-fat diet has not significantly improved quality of life outcomes. The other sort of criticism that always gets levied is, if you eat a lot of saturated fat, it's going to drive up your LDL cholesterol, and that is associated with heart disease. And certainly that association exists, that LDL associates with heart disease in the general population. Again, we can talk about special population. We can talk about metabolically healthy people, for which we have a relative dearth of data. And the data that's coming out these days that looks at those individuals in those populations tend to show perhaps not an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. And we have to also remember that, let's just say you go on a crazy carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet or a low carb diet, and it results in your improvements in metabolic health, better glycemic control, less inflammation, better blood pressure, less obesity, so on and so forth. All of those things unequivocally will increase the likelihood of you not having heart disease. That is to say, as your overall metabolic health improves, and some studies suggest that diabetes is the biggest risk factor. You can look at this Women's Health Initiative done back in 2021, where it shows a dramatic increase in rates of diabetes when it comes to diabetes driving heart disease. The other thing that's important is saturated fat only has a minor effect on LDL cholesterol levels anyway, and this is based on studies that look at saturated fat in the general population, the general food, in the context of, again, Twinkies and Ho-Hos and Doritos and fried food and all the crap that I don't think RFK and certainly I'm suggesting people eat. So there's significant nuance around these topics, and I think we should, listen to what he's saying and not just listen to the pundits that are media propagandists for, the big food companies, the drug manufacturers, and so on and so forth, because they would prefer that you are dependent upon them. They like customers, and so does the healthcare industry. They like having customers. It's the only way they stay in business. Think about that. And the only way they stay in business long term is to keep you chronically hooked on drugs for the rest of your life. If that's not something you're excited about and you want to get off drugs and don't be chronically hooked on the medical system, check out what we're doing at Rivera. We are consistently getting people off pills. We are consistently reversing diseases. We are consistently treating the root cause. We are consistently providing the support, the day-to-day support that it takes to get people through the lifestyle changes that are necessary and make them permanent. That is the whole deal here. It's not some big secret. It's not some magic formula, not some magic supplement, some magic pill, potion, or injection or procedure. It's just consistency with lifestyle, diet, nutrition, so on and so forth, and getting the care you need and the people that can help you to achieve that. All right, one final thing I'd like to say on this topic is saturated fat. Now, it's clear that humans spend a lot of time acquiring food, things like hunting. That required some level of work and effort to put into that. And it's not that you can just eat unlimited amounts of saturated fat or foods containing them, even if they're whole foods like milk, eggs, dairy products, and so on and so forth. And completely have no negative consequences from overconsumption. Realize that if you're, and the reality is most of us aren't out hunting for our foods. We're kind of sitting back at the camp waiting for the food to be brought to us. So there is a limit to how much you can consume. Now, many people find that the appetite is suppressed so much that they don't overconsume. However, that doesn't happen for everybody. And there are people that I have seen that have been able to put on excess body weight by eating these so-called whole foods. So we have to have some level of caution here, that we have to realize that, we want to make sure things are going in the right direction for us, right? So the goal is, to either get lean or remain lean. I think activity is an incredibly important part. I think it's part of the equation. I think we should be physically active people. And I think the saturated fat fuels that. If we're going to just be sedentary, then we're going to have problems. Okay, so saturated fat inherently is not bad for us, but like anything, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. And how do you define too much? Well, I'm gaining body fat, I'm having negative consequences show up in some other form or fashion. Anyway, y'all, thanks for watching. Check out this other video if you want to learn some more stuff. We'll talk to you soon.